Welcome to the Mystery and History channel. Be sure to subscribe and like so you don't miss out on more videos like this one. The presidential election held on November 6, 1860, ended with Abraham Lincoln's victory, even though his name did not appear on the ballots in 10 southern states. He represented the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the country's new territories. The victory was built almost entirely with Northern votes, only 39.8% of the total popular vote, since the divided field between Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and John Bell split the rest of the American electorate among 4 competing candidacies. For the slaveholding states, the result confirmed the fear that they would lose political power in Congress and in the national balance with every new election. Weeks later, leaders in South Carolina began meeting to discuss separation from the Union. Photographers recorded Lincoln with a beard for the first time, a change in appearance suggested in a letter by an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell, who argued that his thin face would look better with a beard and would attract more votes influenced by women. On December 20, 1860, 169 delegates gathered in Charleston, South Carolina, unanimously signed the Ordinance of Secession, making the state the first to formally leave the American Union. Days later, the convention published the Declaration of the Immediate Causes, a document that directly cited Lincoln's election and the defense of slavery as the central reason for the break. Bells rang across the city, and newspapers printed special editions announcing the news. In the following weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed the same path, each approving its own ordinance between January and February 1861. Federal forts in the South, still flying the American flag, became points of growing tension, isolated inside territories that no longer recognized themselves as part of the country, including a small unfinished fort in Charleston Harbor called Sumter. In February 1861, representatives from the states that had left the Union met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, a former senator from Mississippi and United States Secretary of War, was chosen as provisional president. Alexander Stephens of Georgia became vice president. Weeks later, in a speech that became known as the Cornerstone Speech, Stephens openly declared that the new nation was founded on racial inequality as a central principle of its organization. Davis took office on February 18, 1861, on the steps of the Alabama Capitol, promising to defend the independence of the new Confederation. A flag of its own, nicknamed the Stars and Bars, was adopted days later. Meanwhile, in Washington, Lincoln had still not been inaugurated. For weeks, the United States had 2 elected presidents and no unified government over the same territory that had divided the country less than a year earlier. Shortly after Christmas 1860, on December 26th, Major Robert Anderson secretly moved his small garrison from vulnerable Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter, a more defensible fortification in the middle of Charleston Harbor, deeply angering South Carolina authorities. In January 1861, a civilian ship sent to resupply the fort, the Star of the West, was met by fire from Confederate batteries and forced to turn back without delivering supplies, in an episode that already foreshadowed what was coming. In the early morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries finally began the attack on the fort. After 34 hours of continuous assault, Anderson surrendered the position. No soldier was wounded during the main action. The only loss happened during the farewell ceremony to the flag, after an accident involving gunpowder. The news spread by telegraph. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers the next day, and Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, which had still been hesitating, decided to join the Confederacy in direct response to the federal mobilization. The First Battle of Bull Run began on July 21, 1861, when about 35,000 Union and Confederate soldiers faced each other near Manassas, Virginia. Civilians from Washington even brought picnic baskets to watch the fight from a distance, expecting a quick and decisive spectacle. The Confederate Army, reinforced in time by train from the Shenandoah Valley, reversed an early Union advance near the Henry family house and forced a disorganized retreat. Soldiers and spectators returned together along the roads toward the capital. It was there that General Thomas Jackson received the nickname Stonewall, or Stonewall, for holding his lines firm under heavy pressure when a Confederate officer is said to have shouted that he was standing like a stone wall. The battle ended all expectations of a short conflict. The more than 800 military losses recorded that day showed both sides that they were facing a much longer campaign than anyone had predicted in April. The so-called Trent Affair began on November 8, 1861, when Captain Charles Wilkes, commanding the Union warship United States ship San Jacinto, intercepted the British civilian ship Royal Mail ship Trent on the high seas and captured two Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, who were traveling to Europe in search of support. The action, carried out without prior approval from Washington, was initially celebrated as heroism in the North. But in London, it was seen as a serious violation of British maritime neutrality. The United Kingdom government even sent additional troops to Canada and prepared a formal ultimatum. Lincoln, judging that the war could not afford to also face the British Empire, ordered the diplomats released in December of that year, a move that eased tensions considerably. The diplomatic crisis, called the Trent Affair, cooled without direct confrontation, but it made clear how much the Confederacy depended on convincing European powers such as Great Britain and France to recognize its independence or intervene in the conflict. In the waters of Hampton Roads, Virginia, the Confederate state ship Virginia, an armored Confederate ship rebuilt on the hull of the former United States ship Merrimac, put the United States ship Cumberland and the United States ship Congress out of action on March 8, 1862, causing major concern among the Union's wooden ships in the region. The next day, March 9th, the newly arrived United States Ship Monitor, designed by Swedish engineer John Ericsson and equipped with an unprecedented rotating turret, faced the Virginia in the first battle in history between fully iron-armored ships. For almost 4 hours, the two vessels exchanged fire at close range without either one being definitively disabled, ending in a tactical draw that prevented the Virginia from continuing its advance against the rest of the Federal fleet. The clash made wooden warships in the world's navies obsolete almost overnight. Newspapers of the time described crowds along the shore watching the metal duel, aware that they were witnessing the beginning of a new naval era. On April 6, 1862, Confederate forces surprised the Union Army camped near a church called Shiloh in Tennessee. On the first day, the Federals were pushed back to the banks of the Tennessee River and came close to a complete defeat, while General William Tecumseh Sherman suffered 2 minor wounds but stayed on the field. Confederate Commander Albert Sidney Johnston was badly hit that afternoon and died, leaving the offensive without its main leader at a critical moment. Reinforcements commanded by General Ulysses Grant arrived during the night, and the Union retook the lost ground on the second day, April 7th, forcing the Confederate retreat back to Corinth, Mississippi. Shiloh recorded about 23,746 military losses between the two armies, a number higher than the total accumulated by the United States in its earlier conflicts. The scale of the result permanently changed how the public viewed that war. Between June 25 and July 1, 1862, General Robert E. Lee, newly appointed to command the Army of Northern Virginia, launched a series of attacks known as the 7 Days Battles against Union forces advancing on Richmond. The campaign, commanded by General George McClellan, had reached within a few miles of the Confederate capital, the closest any Union army would come to Richmond until 1865. Lee, despite heavy losses in his own army, including the costly final battle at Malvern Hill, where Confederates attacked well-defended positions, managed to push the Federals back to the Virginia coast, ending the immediate threat. The offensive saved Richmond from an early fall and strengthened Lee's reputation as an aggressive commander. McClellan, too cautious by Lincoln standards, would be replaced months later after disappointing Union expectations in that campaign. On the same field as the first battle, near Manassas, Virginia, Confederates under Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson faced the Union again between August 28 and August 30, 1862. Jackson positioned his men along an unfinished railroad cut and resisted waves of Union attacks, and at one point, with ammunition nearly exhausted, his soldiers even threw stones at enemy lines to hold the position. Meanwhile, General James Longstreet organized a surprise flank attack with about 25,000 men, the largest simultaneous coordinated attack of the war, up to that point, which crashed into the Union Army with almost no warning. The Union, under General John Pope, retreated in disorder back toward Washington, repeating the humiliating scene of 1861. The victory gave Lee the confidence to try something the Confederacy had not yet done: directly invade Northern territory. The first major Confederate invasion of the North culminated on September 17, 1862, when Lee's army and General George McClellan's army met near Antietam Creek in Maryland. The fighting centered on places that would gain sadly famous names: the Cornfield, the Sunken Road, and Burnside Bridge. In just over 12 hours, about 23,000 men were recorded as losses, wounded, or missing, making it the military day with the largest number of Americans affected in the country's history, surpassing even D-Day and Pearl Harbor combined. Photographer Alexander Gardner arrived on the field days later and documented the aftermath before crews finished recovering the victims. Shown in New York, the photographs deeply affected the public and revealed the reality of the conflict in a way never seen before. Although tactically indecisive, Antietam forced Lee to return to Virginia, giving Lincoln the political victory he needed to announce a measure that would change the declared purpose of the war. Outside Fredericksburg, Virginia, Union General Ambrose Burnside ordered on December 13, 1862, repeated waves of advances against heavily protected Confederate positions behind a stone wall at Marye's Heights. More than 14 attempts were made against the same point throughout the afternoon, but none managed to break the line commanded by Lee and Longstreet from high ground that dominated the entire open field below. The Union recorded about 12,600 military losses, compared with just over 5,000 on the Confederate side, making the episode one of the most uneven defeats suffered by the North during the entire war. Many Union members remained between the lines through the freezing night, unable to reach shelter. The result caused a serious crisis of confidence in Washington. Lincoln would later comment that he was going through one of the hardest moments of his presidency, and growing pressure would lead to Burnside's replacement a few weeks later. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, signed by Lincoln, went into effect, declaring free now and forever all enslaved people in territories still in rebellion against the Union, after a preliminary version had already been announced the previous September, just after Antietam. The measure did not reach slaveholding states loyal to the North, such as Kentucky and Missouri, but it irreversibly changed the political meaning of the conflict. From that moment on, the war was no longer only about preserving the Union and began to explicitly include the end of slavery as a declared goal, something Lincoln had avoided announcing publicly since the beginning of the conflict for fear of losing support from the border states. The proclamation also opened a legal path for black men to enlist in the Union Army and Navy. Over the next 2 years, more than 180,000 black soldiers would join the federal ranks, many of them formerly enslaved people who fled to Union lines during the war. During the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia, on May 2, 1863, Lee divided his army, already outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, against General Joseph Hooker, in one of the boldest gambles of his military career. Stonewall Jackson led a flank maneuver at dusk that completely surprised the Union Army. causing a disorganized retreat and securing what would be considered Lee's greatest tactical triumph during the war. While returning from nighttime reconnaissance in front of his own lines, Jackson was mistakenly wounded by Confederate sentries who did not recognize him in the darkness. The severity of the injury required emergency surgery that resulted in the loss of his left arm. During recovery, Jackson developed pneumonia and died on May 10, 1863. When Lee received the news, he declared that he had lost the right arm of his army, an absence that would prove decisive in the following months. The small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, became the scene of an almost accidental meeting between Lee's army and General George Meade's army between July 1st and July 3rd, 1863, during the second and final Confederate invasion of the North. On the second day, intense fighting at Little Round Top, defended by Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, prevented the Confederates from turning the Union line. On the third day, Lee ordered a frontal advance against the center of the enemy position, commanded by General George Pickett, with about 12,500 men, crossing nearly 6/10 of a mile of open field under heavy resistance. The action, known as Pickett's Charge, was repelled with extremely high military losses shortly after briefly reaching the Union lines, at a point that came to be called the Confederacy's high water mark. It was the largest battle fought on the American continent, bringing more than 50,000 losses on both sides in 3 days. Lee withdrew his army to Virginia and would never invade the North again. One day after the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, on July 4, 1863, the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrendered to General Ulysses Grant after a 47-day siege, ending a campaign that involved an unconventional river crossing south of the city and an advance through enemy territory using the resources available in the region. Residents and Confederate soldiers even sheltered in caves dug into hillsides to protect themselves from constant Union artillery operations during the weeks of siege. The food shortage became so severe inside the city that accounts from the period mention the use of unusual resources before the surrender of about 29,000 Confederates, who were later released under oath not to return to the ranks. With the fall of Vicksburg, the Union took full control of the Mississippi River, separating Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy. Grant would be promoted months later to command all Union armies. Days after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, New York was overtaken between July 13th and July 16th, 1863, by serious unrest against the Union's new draft law, which allowed wealthy men to pay $300 to avoid enlistment. The mobilization, made up mostly of working-class Irish immigrants, began at the office responsible for the draft lottery and quickly spread across the city, targeting black residents and black community institutions, including the Colored Orphan Asylum. Federal troops, many of them rushed from Gettysburg, were sent to restore order in the streets of Manhattan and used military force to disperse groups in different parts of the city. The New York draft riots remain one of the most tense civil episodes in American history, revealing a nation divided not only between North and South, but also inside northern cities themselves over the true cost of the war. On July 18, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, made up mostly of free black soldiers, led an advance against Fort Wagner, a Confederate fortification in South Carolina that protected access to Charleston. The action, carried out across a narrow strip of sand under intense resistance, caused significant losses for the regiment, including its young white colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, who led the men on the front line and died during the operation. Sergeant William Kearny, even while weakened, managed to recover and protect the regimental flag during the retreat, an act that decades later earned him the Medal of Honor, making him the first black soldier to receive the highest American military decoration. Although the fort was not taken, the courage shown by the 54th Massachusetts was widely reported by the Northern press and helped change public opinion about the role of black soldiers speeding up the recruitment of dozens of new African American regiments by the Union. 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln gave a speech on November 19, 1863, at the dedication ceremony for the National Cemetery created for the soldiers who had lost their lives in the battle. The main speech of the day, lasting more than 2 hours, was delivered by the famous speaker, Edward Everett. Lincoln spoke for less than 3 minutes in about 270 words. He connected the war to the founding principles of equality in the Declaration of Independence and defined the conflict as a test of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people, could survive. There is no confirmed photograph of Lincoln speaking that day, since the photographers present only managed to capture the crowd before and after because the speech was too quick for the equipment of the time. The Gettysburg Address, now one of the most quoted texts in American history, was received quietly by the press at the time, and Lincoln himself is said to have commented that the world would little note his words, a prediction that history would prove completely wrong. Surrounded by mountain ranges and essential to the railroad routes of both sides, Chattanooga, Tennessee, had its Confederate siege broken by Union forces commanded by Grant between November 23 and November 25, 1863. On the second day, Union troops took Lookout Mountain amid fog so dense that part of the fighting was hidden from observers in the valley, an episode that gave the action the nickname Battle Above the Clouds. The most dramatic moment came the next day at Missionary Ridge, when Union soldiers, advancing without an explicit order to continue beyond the base of the hill, took the initiative on their own and climbed the steep slope under Confederate fire, surprising even their own commanders. The victory at Chattanooga opened the way for the invasion of Georgia the following year. Grant, who had already been building a record of success in the West, had his reputation strengthened enough to be called to Washington to take supreme command of the Union armies. On March 9, 1864, Lincoln gave Ulysses Grant the rank of Lieutenant General, a rank until then held only by George Washington, and command of all Union armies, unifying federal strategy across all areas of operation for the first time. Unlike earlier commanders, Grant adopted an approach of constant pressure, advancing simultaneously in multiple regions to prevent the Confederacy, with increasingly scarce resources, from reinforcing one army at the expense of another. Grant chose to personally accompany the Army of the Potomac against Lee in Virginia, meeting him in intense and successive campaigns such as the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, keeping up the pressure even in the face of heavy human results. Meanwhile, he delegated to General William Tecumseh Sherman the mission of advancing through Georgia. The partnership between the two commanders, coordinated by telegraph across distant fronts, would define the final outcome of the war in the following months. Grant's first field meeting with Lee took place between May 5 and May 7, 1864, weeks after Grant took command of all Union armies, in a dense Virginia thicket known as the Wilderness. The thick vegetation made it impossible to see enemy formations only a few yards away, and the confusion of operations caused forest fires that made withdrawal and care for men scattered between the lines even harder. Unlike earlier Union generals who turned back after unfavorable results against Lee, Grant ordered the Army to keep moving south instead of returning to Washington, surprising his own exhausted troops. The Battle of the Wilderness opened the so-called Overland Campaign, a continuous sequence of clashes at Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor that would produce tens of thousands of military losses in the following weeks, but would finally wear down Lee's army in an irreversible way. The occupation of Atlanta, Georgia, happened on September 2, 1864, when Union troops under General Sherman entered the city after months of campaigning and a siege that caused the partial evacuation of the population and the disabling of military and railroad facilities by the retreating Confederates themselves. Sherman ordered nearly all remaining civilians to leave, leading to a harsh exchange of letters with the local mayor, in which the general justified the measure by saying that the conflict imposed severe decisions and that there was no way to make it less difficult. The conquest came at a critical moment. Lincoln faced strong political pressure, with part of Northern public opinion worn down by years of campaigning and open to negotiating peace before the November presidential election. The fall of Atlanta reversed that situation almost overnight, strengthening Lincoln's re-election campaign and signaling to the Confederacy that its chances of reaching a favorable political settlement were rapidly shrinking. The march from Atlanta to the port of Savannah began on November 15, 1864, when Sherman led about 60,000 Union soldiers, deliberately cutting his own supply lines to live off the territory he crossed until December 21st. Foraging groups nicknamed bummers spread across farms along the way, gathering food, livestock, and resources in an improvised logistics system that sustained the advance without depending on convoys vulnerable to attack. The campaign destroyed railroads, warehouses, plantations, and economic infrastructure along a strip more than 62 miles wide in an explicit strategy to reduce the Confederacy's ability to sustain the war, not just to win isolated battles. Sherman offered Savannah as a Christmas gift to Lincoln in a telegram sent on December 22, 1864. The march showed the Confederate population far beyond the front lines that the war had reached their homes. On November 30, 1864, Confederate General John Bell Hood ordered a frontal advance against fortified Union positions in Franklin, Tennessee, in an attempt to stop Federal forces before they reached Nashville. About 20,000 Confederate soldiers crossed nearly 1¼ miles of open field in the late afternoon in an operation so costly that historians compare it, by the proportion of losses, to Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. In a few hours, the Confederate Army of Tennessee lost proportionally more general officers than in any other battle of the war. 6 of them died as a result of the action, including the experienced General Patrick Cleburne. 2 weeks later, on December 15th and December 16th, the rest of Hood's forces suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Nashville. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, one of the South's main military forces, stopped functioning as an effective unit for the rest of the war. After months of congressional resistance, the House of Representatives approved, on January 31, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution, which would abolish slavery throughout the national territory, with 119 votes in favor and 56 against, barely reaching the required 2/3 majority. The Senate had already approved the amendment months earlier, in April 1864, but the House vote faced strong resistance from Democratic lawmakers before finally passing amid intense personal pressure from Lincoln on undecided members of Congress. When the result was announced, representatives and visitors in the galleries burst into celebration inside the chamber, one of the rare moments of spontaneous celebration ever recorded in the American Capitol. The amendment still needed to be ratified by 3/4 of the states to officially take effect, which would only happen in December of that year, months after the end of the war and Lincoln's death, meaning he would not live to see the full ratification of his greatest legislative achievement. On April 1865, after months of siege at Petersburg, Lee informed the Confederate government that his lines had been broken and that Richmond could no longer be defended. President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet left the city by train that same night, taking what remained of the Confederate archives and treasury. Retreating Confederate troops tried to disable warehouses and bridges to prevent the Union from using them, including facilities connected to Tredegar Iron Works, the Confederacy's main center of military production. The actions, however, caused a major fire that spread through the city's commercial district. Federal troops entered on April 3rd and spent part of the day helping control the flames, which had already damaged much of downtown Richmond. 2 days later, Lincoln walked through the streets with almost no escort, surrounded by newly freed people who recognized the president and gathered to see him. The capital that had resisted for 4 years was finally under federal control. Unable to continue fighting, Robert E. Lee met Ulysses Grant on April 9, 1865, in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, to negotiate the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. Grant, who according to his own memoirs had suffered from a severe headache all morning, reported that the discomfort disappeared the moment he received Lee's note proposing the meeting to discuss surrender terms. Grant offered notably generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home freely, keeping horses and mules for planting, as long as they surrendered their weapons and did not take up arms against the United States again. Lee's surrender, although it did not formally end all fighting scattered across the country, became the symbolic moment recognized as the effective end of the war. Grant banned excessive celebrations by his soldiers, reminding them that the Confederates were again fellow citizens. Only 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the night of April 14, 1865, Lincoln was watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington when the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and carried out an attack against the president. Lincoln was taken to a house across from the theater where doctors stayed by his side through the night, recognizing that his condition was extremely serious. He died the next morning, April 15, 1865, becoming the first American president to lose his life in an assassination. Vice President Andrew Johnson took office hours later amid the shock caused by the news spreading across the country. Booth fled on horseback and was found 12 days later on a rural property in Virginia, where he died during the attempt by federal troops to arrest him. Lincoln, who had guided the country through 4 years of war, did not live to witness the reconstruction of the nation he had worked so hard to reunify. Even after Appomattox, Lee's surrender did not end the war immediately because several Confederate armies still remained in the field. On April 26, 1865, General Joseph Johnston surrendered to General Sherman in North Carolina, handing over the second-largest Confederate force still active. During the same period, about 81 miles away in Georgia, Union cavalry finally caught and detained Jefferson Davis, who had been traveling since the fall of Richmond while trying to reorganize the Confederate government through the interior of the country. The last organized forces in the Trans-Mississippi, commanded by General Kirby Smith, would only formally surrender on May 26, 1865, more than a month after Appomattox, ending any coordinated military opposition from the Confederacy. 4 years after the first events at Fort Sumter, the conflict that began after Lincoln's election ended with human losses estimated at about 620,000 soldiers, slavery abolished by constitutional amendment, and an entire nation facing the task of rebuilding itself. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, please use the Super Thanks tool below. Your contribution helps us keep bringing you amazing historical content. Thank you so much for your support, and see you in the next video.